Okay, so before we move on to impact of climate on human evolution, we must understand some of the things like adaptation and adaptability, which we will keep mentioning. In general language, in common language, or even in some scientific literature from psychology and so on, there is no distinction between adaptation and adaptability, whereas this book sticks to the convention that adaptation is genetic, hence it is heritable, whereas adaptability is a phenotypical or environmental response, behavioral response, can be anatomical changes as well, but that's not genetic, it's epigenetic, not heritable, and so on. So if we go back to what Lamarck and Darwin differed on, Darwin did look at what are called homologies. So here are the examples: homologies of the forelimb in 6 vertebrates, so similar structures in the various organs or limbs, so humerus, radius, ulna, carpals, metacarpals, and phalanges, and of course comparison of analogous structures, for example hind legs of insects, fish and dolphin so the fish fin and dolphin flippers, horse legs and insect legs here, insect wing and chicken wing, and so on. So the idea was that things gradually evolved over time, not organism driven but random mutations and then natural selection according to Darwin, whereas Lamarck was insisting on organisms seeking evolution for their own benefit, survival, propagation, and so on. So keeping that in mind, if they are related, are they so obviously Darwin couldn't find all the fossils to fill the gaps between, for example, an insect to a horse, right? Horse is a mammal and it has a placenta, and placental development along the way would have made a big difference in the way the body itself works and how adaptability, or dealing with changes in the environmental forcings, would affect species. Okay, so if you think about humans, for example, another top of the chain placental animal, we have multiple systems: the skeletal system, the endocrine system, digestive system, and so on. And there is something called homeostasis, which is obviously very important for placental animals, where we can control internal body temperature in response to, or in general, even if the environmental temperature changes, the body is able to generate internal heat to some extent to try to keep the body temperatures the same. And there are even deeper homeostasis aspects, like the hypothalamus, for example, can change the secretion of hormones like epinephrine, norepinephrine, to change the metabolic burning of fats to produce heat, and so on and so forth. And that's adaptation. So our body has evolved to have this homeostasis, whereas, and that's genetically propagated, whereas there are many things like bodybuilding, for example. You can change your anatomy, or living in colder temperatures can change the fat stored, can change hemoglobin, can change various features that are epigenetic. They are not necessarily propagated. And humans now, for example, living in different climates, darker skin in hotter tropical climate versus lighter skin in higher latitudes, etc. They are changes that are adaptability changes, not necessarily genetic changes. So even though we have lived in different climates look different in terms of body sizes, skin colors, and so on, we are still able to completely interbreed. So we are not really separate species. We haven't become separate species, right? So adaptation again is what genetically gets propagated, whereas adaptability are behavioral changes, can even be anatomical changes, and so on. So evolution of placenta along the way would have allowed homeostasis to take hold, but the placenta itself has had different morphologies. Placenta is basically something that grows within the uterus that links to the maternal cell structure to transfer nutrients, blood, oxygen, and remove waste, and so on. So you can see here different types of placentas and different animals that are involved in it. I won't go into the technical details necessarily, but just want to say that placenta was not a environmentally forced evolution. It was something internal, and then this creates what are called generative abilities to adapt to different things, like diets. These are ruminants, for example, which eat differently than a pig. For example, cats and dogs have different placenta and relation to things like rodents. And of course there are other details. For example, when a baby is born, it's not able to immediately get up and walk, and as it grows it begins to acquire the ability to walk, but that is not genetic. That depends on the brain development and brain telling it to start to move, to try to stand up, to walk, and so on. So what is inherited there and what is the response of the development of the brain are not exactly the same. So adaptation and adaptability in that sense tend to continue to be very different. For example, the example of Slijper's goat, which I referred to in the title of this podcast, is where a Dutch scientist had a goat that was two-legged, and you see this example now in many places. So normal goat has 4 legs. A two-legged goat could manage to learn to walk with human help, and because of that its anatomical structure actually changed in terms of its muscle structure, muscle memory, back structure, spinal structure, and so on, became more like a kangaroo rather than a goat. And the human spinal structure, skeletal structure, of course, is very different because it's bipedal as well. So even though this became bipedal by accident, happens to many dogs that can walk around on 2 legs after losing legs for some reason or the other, and so on. But humans obviously have evolved to be bipedal, and their spinal skeletal structure, connection to this cranium, and have so on, have evolved. So that's genetic, whereas this is an adaptation. So this goat will not obviously propagate bipedalism to its offspring. It is just something that it adapted to based on its conditions. So adaptation is genetic, adaptability is behavioral, anatomic, developmental, can be hormonal as well, and we have to always distinguish those things. What also happens is if you have the same genetic material, you can put the species in different temperatures, different climates, as I already mentioned. So here's an example of the developmental plasticity as it is referred to. So here is a fly, let's say, developing at a lower temperature. In general, body size gets bigger. These are called allometric scalings, where the at birth, for example, you have certain proportion of hands, legs, chest, brain, lungs, heart, but as you grow, they don't grow proportionally bigger. The things grow in different proportions. Limbs get longer, heart gets bigger, but not as big as how long the brain gets or the limbs get, and so on and so forth. So those allometric scalings will depend, for some same species, can depend on climate, like temperature, whereas tropical species in general and higher temperature species tend to have smaller body size, but if you just compare, let's say, the same species of tuna living in higher latitudes and lower latitudes, you can have such differences which can transform over time into differences in age at sexual maturity, reproduction, and lifespan, and so on and so forth. So there is something called allopatric speciation, where if species are separated for long enough, they may become sterile with respect to each other, in the sense they become separate species that can only breed with each other. So unlike humans, who are now existing in different climates, can have different morphological, anatomical features, maybe even heart sizes, melanin in the skin, and lung size, and so on, they can still interbreed, whereas maybe with long enough separation you can create different species. So this is another example of a butterfly which also has differences in structures and design of the wings, for example. So these are the details on phenotypes, and that means environmental response of the same genotype in terms of anatomical and other differences. Can also mean behavioral differences as well. There are examples of how human impact on cichlids in Lake Victoria have created different foraging behavior, how the newer cichlids are more brave in going into regions where there are more predators, for example, and so on. So adaptability and behavioral change can begin to influence each other, and genetic adaptation then is something that is inherited. So we have to then combine that, coming back to our main goal of understanding climate impact on evolution. You can think of fish, for example, who have evolved over time, and they have, let's say, gone from being evolved in saltwater to colonize freshwater, or colonize land and become amphibians, reptiles, and then placental animals, and so on. So oxygen, for example, has changed over time. Photosynthesis came along, increased the atmospheric oxygen. So fish that lived in saltwater migrating to freshwater have to make anatomical changes to deal with osmosis and loss of body fluid, how much urine they produce, to deal with less salty water or more salty water, how they breathe in low oxygen environment versus living on land as reptiles, or high oxygen environments, and so on and so forth. So the evolution does get affected by atmosphere. Speciations occur, but we still have to remember adaptation and adaptability, that they are not mutually exclusive, but they are not exactly the same. They are not at all the same in this book. Okay, as I said, in general colloquial language, people tend to use them interchangeably, but this book insists that they shouldn't be used interchangeably. Okay, you can add many such details and examples, but I think this should suffice for the sake of moving on to the next chapter about the evolution of modern humans, which is related to climate in terms of how they migrated out of Africa and mixed with others which were living in different climates, like Neanderthals in colder climates, with Homo lineages coming out of Africa, other Homo lineages coming out of Africa, for example. Okay, so just remember adaptation, adaptability, genetic features, inherited features versus phenotypic or genetic expression based on environmental factors. Okay, so behavioral adaptations, like human beings moving to colder climates by wearing clothes or mastering fire, versus other anatomical features, changes like pumping iron to become a bodybuilder. There are some evidences that certain things like Mathematical abilities, musical abilities are inherited, so it's not always clear whether they are genetic or not, but obviously if they are inherited there must be a genetic component. And there are brain structure differences in terms of amygdala, for example. I'll mention that it's something that's in the brain that converts physical experiences like fear and happiness and love to emotional responses, and amygdala can be larger for artists and smaller for non-artists, so cortical structures can be different. There are arguments that for religious people, spiritual people versus non-spiritual people, it can be different as well, and so on. So whether that is genetic inheritability or just epigenetic inheritability and so on, I'll get into details that we don't necessarily need in this course. Okay, so let's leave it here and come back to adaptation and adaptability as we go along, because we will look at climate change and how that could have induced human adaptation, and adaptability would have helped survival as well. Okay.